So I'm going to do an overview of carbon capture and storage, not specific to capturing from an ethanol facility, but in general. And we can come back to some of the issues with ethanol capture at some point. So I'm going to start with just sort of carbon capture 101. And I want to emphasize here that I'm talking about what we call mechanical, industrial, chemical, mechanical carbon capture, not biological sequestration, which is a whole other topic, of course. So for short, I just call it mechanical carbon capture. There's two kinds. One is, there's two kinds of carbon capture, and there's three choices for what you do with the CO2 when you've captured it. So the two kinds of capture are, one, you can capture it from sources, and two, you pull it out of the air. So in terms of ethanol facilities, we're talking about what they call point source capture. That's what's usually meant when you hear the term CCS. The terminology, by the way, is terrible. There's massive confusion of the terminology, and different people use it different ways, but CCS generally refers to point source capture, including ethanol facilities. And the other way that it's being done is direct air capture, and we're not talking about that today, but they're both mechanical methods that use chemicals to separate out CO2 from the air or from the flue gases coming out of a smokestack. So just to set what's going on in the Midwest in context, this is a list of the current CCS operations, carbon capture operations in the US right now, commercial operations right now, and there's only 12 of them. Just 3 of them are ethanol. And you hear an awful lot about carbon capture these days, but there's really not much of it going on because it's too expensive and there hasn't been enough public subsidy, although all of these operations are subsidized from the public by the taxpayer. And I do want to call your attention to the far right-hand column there that talks about the maximum capacity per year, 1 million tons per year. And this is actually, all these numbers are from the Global CCS Institute, and all I have found are exaggerated. They say what they're supposed to capture, but when you read up on them, you find out that they're not capturing anywhere near what their goal was. But their goal at any rate adds up to a little under 12 million tons a year. The largest one being about, I think it was 7 or 8 million tons a year. And yet in the Midwest, they're saying that they're going to capture a total of, I guess it's another 20 million per year with the 3 pipeline endeavors. And, we'll see if that actually happens. This is just to point out that there's no carbon capture going on at a power plant in the United States today. These are the CCS projects that received hundreds of millions of federal funds over the years. They all have been canceled, withdrawn, failed, shuttered. None of them have worked, none of them. The only CCS at a power plant on the planet today is one power plant in Canada, Boundary Dam it's called, and they're having massive problems, and it raised the cost of electricity up there to the customers by about 2 times at least. Okay, so that's the kinds of carbon capture that there are. Then what do you do with the CO2 once you've it? There's 3 choices. You can inject it underground, inject it underground for storage. You can sell it to somebody else as chemical feedstock to supposedly make various things, or to use it in fizzy drinks or biofuel or fuel manufacture, whatever. Or you can sell it for oil extraction in a process called enhanced oil recovery, which Jane mentioned. And as you can see in the right-hand column, this is that same chart with the storage type column in red there. You can see all 95% of the CO2 that's been captured through CCS in the United States has been used to extract more oil. Only one of them, the ethanol facility in Illinois, has been burying it, and they have had subsidies for that. all of these projects are subsidized by the taxpayer as well. What's enhanced oil recovery? Basically, it's a way, it's sort of like, you could call it fracking. It's a method in which CO2 is injected ground to sort of squeeze out the oil that remains in oil wells that have been partially depleted, and it squeezes out the rest of the oil that's left. And I recognize that in the case of Summit Navigator, they are now saying they're not going to use the captured CO2 for EOR. Early reports, Summit did indicate that they were considering and perhaps planning or considering to use the CO2 for EOR because there are EOR oil fields in North Dakota, which is where the captured CO2 is, of course, headed for. So we don't know. Risks and hazards, toxicity. So I want to talk just a second here about the toxic chemicals, which is how CO2 is captured. The word captured is nice, but basically it's a chemical process. Now, this chart, this slide is what I prepared for. It's broad for CCS, point source capture, and DAC. The last two dot points there, MEA is what is typically used for, is the chemical typically used for capture for CCS, point source capture, and to make it ethylene oxide is used in the production of it. I actually don't know the extent to which MEA is used in the production, in the capture of ethanol, in the capture of CO2 from ethanol plants, but I haven't read any place that there's an exception for ethanol plant production, but it's something to look into. Certainly when toxic chemicals are used for carbon capture, which is basically how capture is done for the most part, there should be, and has not been really, a full life cycle analysis of the toxic risks, including the upstream chemicals production, and then downstream, if you're using these toxic chemicals for capture, what are the residual wastes and where do the wastes go? And there's a literature on that, but it varies by the type of chemical used and a number of other factors. Pipelines, of course, you've all seen this map of the pipelines planned for the Midwest by the three companies that are planning to build them. And just to reiterate the point that Jane made a few minutes ago, CO2, once it's captured, it's a gas, basically. It's in a gaseous state when it comes out of the air or comes out of smokestacks. It has to then be compressed into a form that's most suitable for transport via pipelines, and that is, it is compressed into a supercritical state, meaning a semi-liquid state, and that requires a whole lot more pressure than is required for natural gas pipelines. So as you can see here, the pressurization required for CO2 transport is far in excess of the pressurization required for natural gas transport. Compressors require a great deal of energy. So there has to be, and in the case of, this is a picture of the ADM facility in Illinois, where they've been capturing ethanol for quite a long time. They've been using largely natural gas to process their compression, their CCS operation, from what I've read. I'm not sure what they're using now, but that's what they have been using. It takes a great deal of energy to run the compressors to compress the CO2 into semi-liquid state. And then in some cases, there has to be compressor booster stations to keep the pressurization going. I don't know if there would be compressors required for the pipelines in Minnesota. The need for compressor booster stations, which require additional energy, of course, and means additional facilities that look like this. The need depends on the how long the pipelines are and the diameter of the pipelines, and maybe they won't be required in Minnesota for CO2 pipelines, but I don't know. It's something else to look into. This is just a list. Dan's going to talk much more about the problems, but I just put this list together of leakage, blowouts, et cetera, in the last 10 years. There was a blowout in a storage site In Mississippi in 2011, workers sent to hospitals. Back then, there was a bubbling creek because of unpermitted releases of CO2. There was a series of leaks in Wyoming. There was a school in Wyoming that was forced to close and houses evacuated because of leakage of CO2 from a EOR storage site. And then, of course, the pipeline rupture in Mississippi, which Dan will tell us a great deal about. And lastly, I just want to call your attention to this source, which is a Department of Energy, NETL National Energy Lab report called Overview of Potential Failure Modes and Effects Associated with CO2 Injection and Storage Operations in Saline Formations. And so this report, this is just some copies of pages from the report. This report does provide information about so-called failure modes and effects. This is a map, a diagram of seismic events, earthquakes associated or possibly associated with the ethanol, with the injection of the CO2 from the ethanol facility in Illinois over the years that it's been operating. And it's not clear whether all of these seismic events are due to that injection and storage, but that's what they were studying here. And this is a diagram of various so-called failure modes of and effects of failures of CO2 storage, pipeline injection and storage. So that's what I have for you. And Dan is going to give us a lot more information. There's my email if any of you would like further information, if I could be helpful. Thank you all.